Chapter 1. The Creaking Door. The night was still, the air thick with dust and the scent of rotting wood. Jonathan had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but as he stood in front of the old decaying house, a shiver ran down his spine. The wooden structure groaned under its own weight, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the endless night. He hesitated before placing his hand on the rusted doorknob. With a deep breath, he twisted it. A sharp, ear-piercing creak shattered the silence as the door slowly swung open. The hinges, ancient and corroded, whined like a wounded animal. Inside, a deep darkness loomed, swallowing the dim moonlight that dared to enter. Jonathan stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight flickering as though sensing the unnatural presence within. The floor beneath him protested with each step, the wooden planks brittle and cracked. Dust floated in the stagnant air, disturbed for the first time in what seemed like centuries. He had barely taken a few steps when he heard it. An echo, soft but distinct, a whisper of movement from deep within the house. He paused, straining to listen. Silence. Then, just as he was about to dismiss it, the door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Jonathan spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A presence loomed in the shadows, unseen but undeniable. A low, almost imperceptible sound rose from the floorboards beneath him. A sigh, a whisper, a warning. He wasn't alone. Chapter 2. Shadows Beneath the Floor. Jonathan stood frozen in place, his breath shallow. The house had gone eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of settling wood. But beneath his feet there was something else, a noise too rhythmic, too deliberate to be the natural creaks of an old structure. It was as if something was shifting beneath the floorboards, moving with purpose. Kneeling slowly, he pressed his palm against the wooden planks. They were ice cold. A soft vibration hummed through them, faint but undeniable. His flashlight beam skimmed the floor, revealing gaps between the boards wide enough to see the darkness below. He squinted, trying to make out any shapes beneath, but it was nothing but blackness. Then movement. His heart clenched as a shadow, fluid and stretching unnaturally, slithered beneath him. It was gone in an instant, but the weight of its presence remained. Jonathan scrambled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He hadn't imagined it. There was something under the house. Determined to find out what, he searched the room for anything that could pry the floorboards loose. His hands landed on a rusted crowbar left near the fireplace. Wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans, he positioned the tool against one of the planks and applied pressure. The old wood groaned in protest before giving way with a sickening snap. Dust billowed into the air as Jonathan peered into the exposed cavity beneath the house. The space was larger than expected, almost like a hidden crawl space. But the air that seeped from below carried a foul stench, thick with decay and dampness. His flashlight flickered as he shone it into the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, something moved. A skeletal hand, pale, bony, and impossibly long, slid into view from the shadows below. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the fingers twitched, reaching for the edge of the broken floor. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the hand retreated into the blackness, as if it had never been there at all. Chapter 3: The Whispering Darkness. Jonathan's breath was ragged, the air around him suddenly dense with an unnatural stillness. The gaping hole in the floor revealed nothing but an abyss of shadows, swallowing his flashlight's beam as if the darkness itself was alive. His skin prickled, every instinct screaming at him to run, but curiosity held him in place. He leaned closer, listening. Then the whispers began. At first they were faint, like a distant echo bouncing off damp stone. Words he couldn't quite decipher, spoken in hushed, hurried tones. But they weren't coming from beneath the floor. They were all around him. A chorus of unseen voices murmuring, growing more distinct with every second. Jonathan's fingers tightened around his flashlight as his pulse thundered in his ears. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The moment the words left his lips, the whispers stopped. A pause. Then a voice. A single chilling voice answered. "We see you." Jonathan stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. The darkness beneath the floor seemed to shift, expanding outward. The very shadows stretched toward him, as though reaching with unseen hands. The cold was suffocating, seeping into his bones. He forced himself to look down into the opening again, and for a fleeting second he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, gleaming unnaturally from the void, unblinking and locked onto him. Jonathan gasped, stumbling backward, his foot caught on the edge of the broken floorboard, sending him sprawling onto the ground. The flashlight skittered from his grip, rolling toward the hole and casting fractured beams of light along the walls. In that moment, the whispers returned, louder, closer, surrounding him. His mind reeled. He had to get out. With a desperate lunge, he grabbed the flashlight and scrambled to his feet. But before he could run, a low groan echoed from below, reverberating through the house. The floor trembled, the wood beneath his feet quivering like something massive was shifting beneath it. Then the whispering stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air. But Jonathan knew better. The thing in the cellar had woken up. Chapter 4: Footsteps in the Dust. Jonathan's pulse pounded as he strained to listen. The whispering had stopped, but something else had taken its place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching softly against the dust-covered floor. They weren't his. He wasn't moving. He held his breath, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The sound came from the hallway just beyond the room, the rhythmic steps growing louder, closer. Jonathan willed himself to move, to run, but his legs felt paralyzed, as though the house itself had anchored him in place. Then silence. The footsteps had stopped just outside the door. Jonathan's heartbeat drummed against his ribs as he took a cautious step back. His flashlight flickered, once, twice, and in that brief moment of darkness, he heard the unmistakable creak of the door slowly opening. He spun the beam toward it, but the door remained shut. Something was playing with him. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself forward, He needed to see what was on the other side. With trembling fingers, he reached for the doorknob and twisted it open. The hallway stretched before him, lined with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. The dust lay undisturbed, except for one thing: a trail of footprints, fresh, leading toward the cellar door at the end of the hallway. Jonathan swallowed hard. Someone had walked through here. Or something. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his own boots imprinting next to the phantom tracks. The air thickened as he neared the cellar door. The wood warped and splintered from age. A rusted latch held it shut, but as he reached for it, the door shuddered violently, rattling on its hinges. Jonathan jerked his hand back. The footsteps had led here, and whatever had made them was waiting on the other side. Chapter 5: The Locked Trap Door. Jonathan hesitated before the cellar door. The footprints in the dust had led him here, and now he faced the very thing he had dreaded from the moment he stepped into the house. The wooden door was warped with age, but the iron latch holding it shut looked almost new. He reached out, but the metal was freezing cold to the touch, as if it had been resting in ice rather than in the damp confines of an old house. He took a deep breath and pulled. The latch didn't budge. He pulled harder, his fingers slipping against the cold iron. It was locked. He stepped back, shining his flashlight over the wooden panels. There was no visible keyhole, no hinges, just the solid door, barring him from whatever lay beneath. Jonathan's instincts screamed at him to leave it alone, to turn back and abandon this place. But the whispers in the walls, the shifting shadows, and the thing he had seen beneath the floorboards told him otherwise. Something was down there, something that had been locked away for a reason. He searched the room for anything that could pry the trapdoor open. His eyes landed on an old rusted crowbar leaning against the wall. He grabbed it and wedged it into the seam between the boards. With a grunt, he pushed down, muscles straining as the wood groaned in protest. The iron latch twisted, and with one final push, the trapdoor snapped open with a deafening crack. Jonathan stepped back as dust and debris billowed into the air. A wave of cold, putrid air rushed from the opening, thick with the scent of damp rot and something else, something foul and unidentifiable. His flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness below. The cellar yawned before him, deep and endless, the stairs leading downward disappearing into pure blackness. Then, from within the depths of the cellar, he heard it. A scraping sound. Slow, deliberate, as if something with long clawed fingers was dragging itself across the stone floor below. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. Chapter 6: Secrets Buried Below. Jonathan stared down into the gaping hole before him, the cellar exhaling a breath of cold, stagnant air that carried the scent of decay. His flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness, illuminating a rickety wooden staircase that disappeared into the void. The edges of the opening were worn smooth, as if many had passed this way before him. But who and why? With a deep breath, he descended. The first step groaned under his weight, dust rising in a thin, swirling mist. His grip on the railing was firm, but the wood felt brittle, as though it might snap at any moment. Step by step, he moved downward, the light trembling in his shaking hands. Halfway down, something shifted in the darkness below. Jonathan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was subtle, like the rustling of fabric or the scrape of something heavy against stone. He swept the flashlight across the cellar floor, but the shadows devoured the light, refusing to give up their secrets. The last step creaked as he reached the bottom. The floor beneath him was stone, cold and damp beneath his feet. His flashlight revealed a large, open space, lined with old shelves stacked with forgotten relics, rotting books, broken furniture, rusted tools. But there was something else. Against the farthest wall stood a large wooden crate, its surface covered in strange markings carved deep into the wood. Jonathan's pulse quickened. The symbols were unfamiliar, almost ancient. He stepped closer, running his fingers over the etchings. The air felt heavier here, charged with something unseen. With a trembling hand, he lifted the lid. A body, or what remained of one. The skeletal remains were wrapped in tattered cloth, bones yellowed with age. A rusted chain was wrapped around the ribcage, locking the corpse in place. Jonathan recoiled, his stomach twisting. Someone had buried this body down here, bound it in iron, and sealed it away. But why? The moment the thought crossed his mind, a noise erupted from behind him. The long, drawn-out breath. Jonathan spun, flashlight shaking. The shadows seemed to pulse, shifting unnaturally. And then, movement. Something was in the darkness with him, watching. Then, as the light flickered, the crate beside him moved, just an inch, just enough to tell him one terrible truth. The thing in the cellar wasn't dead. Chapter 7. The Old Journal. Jonathan's fingers trembled as he pulled an old dust-covered journal from one of the shelves in the cellar. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the edges brittle with age. Strange symbols were embossed on its surface, similar to the ones carved into the wooden crate. His pulse quickened as he flipped open the first page, revealing pages filled with cramped handwritten text. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. They told us not to come here. The door should have never been opened. We should have left well enough alone. Jonathan swallowed hard. The entries were dated over a century ago, chronicling the lives of the house's former inhabitants. One name appeared repeatedly, Elias Graves, the owner of the estate and the man who, according to legend, had gone mad before his mysterious disappearance. The journal detailed strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, objects moving on their own, the feeling of being watched. But as Jonathan read further, the entries became more erratic, the handwriting shaking with fear. It comes at night. It waits in the cellar. The others are gone. I hear them calling from beneath the floorboards. Jonathan turned the page, his breath catching. A crude drawing had been sketched across the parchment. A monstrous figure, its elongated limbs stretching in unnatural angles, its face obscured by darkness. Then, at the very bottom of the page, in large, desperate letters, "It knows when you see it." Jonathan's flashlight flickered violently, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over him. He looked up, his breath shallow. The air in the cellar had grown impossibly cold. The crate where he had found the body was now slightly ajar, and in the silence, something shifted in the darkness beyond. Chapter 8. Eyes in the Blackness. Jonathan stood frozen, his breath shallow as his flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows along the stone walls of the cellar. The crate beside him lay still, yet he could feel something watching him. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down upon him like a suffocating fog. He lifted his flashlight, the beam trembling as it sliced through the darkness. The shelves of rotting books and rusted tools stood undisturbed, but the sense of presence remained. He turned slowly, scanning the room. The air had grown impossibly cold, his breath visible in wispy clouds. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. Then, something moved in the corner of his vision. Jonathan snapped his flashlight toward the source, the beam illuminating a patch of darkness near the farthest wall. At first, there was nothing, just the rough, decaying stone. But then, eyes, countless eyes gleaming like dim embers floating within the void. They were not reflections. They were watching him. A chill crept down his spine as his mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The eyes were not set into any discernible face. They hovered in the darkness, blinking in slow unison, shifting ever so slightly as if adjusting their gaze. Jonathan's throat tightened. He took a cautious step back. The eyes moved closer. A low guttural sound rumbled from the shadows. It wasn't a growl, nor a whisper. It was something in between, something unnatural. Jonathan's grip on the flashlight tightened, his fingers slick with sweat. His instinct screamed at him to run, to flee from the cellar and never return, but his legs refused to move. The eyes flickered. Then, in an instant, they surged forward. Jonathan stumbled backward, his flashlight beam shaking wildly as the darkness itself seemed to lurch toward him. He scrambled for footing, knocking over a shelf in the process. Books and debris tumbled to the ground with a thunderous crash, but he barely registered the noise. His mind was consumed by a single, horrifying realization. The darkness was alive. A sudden gust of icy air rushed past him, extinguishing his flashlight entirely. Jonathan's world was plunged into absolute blackness. He gasped, his fingers fumbling to switch it back on, but before he could, something cold brushed against his arm. A hand. Not human. Too long, too thin. Jonathan screamed. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Light. Jonathan's world was swallowed by absolute darkness. The moment his flashlight died, the cellar became a void, a suffocating, impenetrable blackness that consumed every sense of direction. Panic clutched at his chest, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as he fumbled to switch the flashlight back on. Click. Nothing. He hit it against his palm, but it refused to respond. The only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, until another sound emerged. Breathing, slow, measured, and not his own. Jonathan's pulse quickened. The sound was close, too close. He willed himself to stay still, barely daring to inhale. The cellar was not large, Whatever had been lurking in the darkness had now closed the distance between them. He reached out blindly, his fingers grazing the stone wall beside him. The cold felt grounding, something solid in the overwhelming void. He had to move. Now, he took a cautious step backward, his foot pressing into the damp earth beneath him. Another breath, closer this time. Then, something brushed against his arm. A whisper of movement. A touch too light to be imagined. Jonathan jerked away, stumbling over unseen debris. He hit the ground hard, his palms scraping against rough stone. His flashlight tumbled from his grasp, rolling somewhere beyond his reach. His breathing turned erratic as he crawled blindly, desperate to find the flashlight. Anything to bring back the light. Then, a flicker. Jonathan froze. In the distance, faint and shivering in the thick dark, a single sliver of light appeared. It pulsed once, then again. A beacon, a way out, or a lure? His mind screamed at him to question it, but survival instincts took hold. He forced himself forward, feeling along the damp floor, inching toward the light. His fingers brushed against cold metal, his flashlight. Hands trembling, he flipped the switch. The beam flickered weakly to life and revealed something standing mere inches away from him. A face. Hollow eyes, stretched skin, a grin too wide to be human. Then, in an instant, the light was gone again. Jonathan screamed. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Forgotten. Jonathan's screams faded into the void as the darkness consumed him. He could feel his breath coming in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding like a drum in his ears. The cellar walls seemed to close in, the stale air pressing against his skin like an unseen force. His flashlight, useless now, lay somewhere in the blackness, and his only hope was to crawl forward, feeling his way along the uneven stone floor. A whisper slithered through the silence. Not a voice, not entirely. It was more of an impression, a collection of memories, disjointed and frayed. Jonathan froze. The sound came from everywhere at once, as though the very walls were speaking to him. "You shouldn't be here." His body tensed as the words registered in his mind. They were not his own thoughts. He pressed his palms to the cold stone, feeling a faint vibration, a pulsing rhythm, like the slow heartbeat of something ancient and buried beneath the house. Then, the memories came. Flashes of images, people he had never seen, figures clad in old-fashioned clothing, their faces twisted in fear, the same cellar but in another time, a candlelit ritual, desperate voices chanting in unison, a woman screaming, a man digging, a shadow stretching across the walls, reaching for them. Then, nothing. Jonathan gasped as he was yanked back to the present. His mind reeled, his body drenched in sweat despite the cold. The echoes of the past had brushed against him, leaving behind fragments of their terror. But why? What had happened here? And what had they buried? The whisper returned, softer now, almost pleading. "Leave, before it wakes." Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his instincts screaming at him to obey, but something in the darkness shifted. A presence he could feel but not see. It was watching him, waiting. The air thickened, the cellar itself seeming to inhale. He had the overwhelming sensation that the house, this place, was alive, feeding off the fear of those who entered. He took a step backward. The ground beneath him trembled. The echoes of the forgotten were not just memories, they were warnings, and he had ignored them. Chapter 11. The Crawling Horror. Jonathan pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his breath ragged as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. The whispering voices had faded, but the oppressive darkness remained, wrapping around him like an invisible shroud. He reached for his flashlight with trembling hands, but as he lifted it, the dim glow revealed something that sent ice through his veins. The ground was moving, not shifting like loose soil, nor trembling like an earthquake. It was slithering. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. Long, sinewy limbs, pale and featureless, writhing across the cellar floor like a mass of living roots. They twisted and coiled over one another, reaching, searching. His stomach lurched. They weren't roots. They were fingers. Jonathan scrambled backward, the soles of his boots scraping against the stone as he tried to put distance between himself and the thing creeping toward him. The fingers, if that's what they were, stretched unnaturally long, moving with a sickening, deliberate grace. The darkness obscured their origin. Were they coming from the floor, the walls, or something deeper within the cellar? He didn't want to know. A whisper slid through the air, barely audible but unmistakable. "It's awake." Jonathan bolted. He ran blindly through the cellar, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his grip, casting erratic shadows across the ancient stone walls. The sound of slithering hands followed, a grotesque wet scraping that sent his heart hammering. He had to get out. He had to find the stairs. His foot caught on something, a discarded crate maybe, and he fell hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his knee as he scrambled up, but before he could rise, he felt it. The hand clutching his ankle. Jonathan screamed, kicking wildly, his boot connecting with something unnervingly soft. The grip released, and he scrambled to his feet, gasping. His flashlight beam flickered, revealing a glimpse of the horror that lurked in the cellar's depths. A figure, hunched and twisted, half emerged from the ground. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Jonathan could see its hands, elongated, skeletal, fingers twitching as if eager to seize him again. Then, in a voice that did not belong to this world, it spoke. Jonathan turned and ran, the sound of crawling limbs chasing him through the dark. Chapter 12. The Final Descent. Jonathan staggered through the damp, suffocating air of the cellar, his flashlight flickering weakly as he pressed forward. The tunnel he had discovered twisted and curved unnaturally, as if the very earth had been reshaped by something not of this world. The stone walls were slick with moisture, but as he ran his hand along them for balance, he realized they weren't just damp. They pulsed like living flesh. He pulled his hand away, disgusted, but there was no time to dwell on it. The whispering had returned, no longer distant but right beside him, brushing against his ears with ghostly fingers. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were voices, clearer, urgent, insistent. Turn back. The door is closing. The door is closing. Jonathan had no idea what they meant, but every instinct screamed at him to move forward. He forced himself to keep going, deeper into the passage that spiraled downward like a descending maze. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to crouch, then to crawl. His breath came in ragged gasps as the walls pressed in closer, making each movement an agonizing effort. The smell of rot thickened, a sickly sweet stench that coated his tongue and made his stomach churn. Then he saw it. The door. Not wooden, not stone, but something ancient and alien. The surface rippled like a liquid caught between states, shimmering in the dim glow of his flashlight. Symbols were etched into its surface, shifting when he tried to focus on them. And beyond it, Jonathan could feel something waiting. The voices grew frantic. "It knows! It knows!" Jonathan's fingers hovered over the door, the unnatural warmth pulsing beneath his fingertips. He had come too far to turn back now. The whispers, the shadows, the creature that had nearly dragged him into the abyss, all of it had led him here. Taking a deep breath, he placed his palm flat against the door. It opened. A rush of freezing air exploded outward, nearly knocking him off his feet. His flashlight sputtered, its beam stretching into a vast chamber beyond. Jonathan stepped inside, his heart hammering. The room was enormous, lined with towering statues of figures twisted beyond human form. Their faces were shrouded, elongated fingers reaching toward an altar at the chamber's center. And upon that altar lay something wrapped in chains, bound in symbols that matched those on the door. Jonathan stepped closer, the air vibrating with an unseen energy. The whispers stopped entirely, replaced by a silence so profound it rang in his ears. He reached out to touch the chains, compelled by something deep in his bones. Then, the thing beneath them opened its eyes. A shriek tore through the chamber, not from the creature but from the walls themselves. The statues groaned, shifting as if awakening. The ground beneath him cracked, the air thickening like molasses, dragging at his limbs. Jonathan stumbled backward, his mind screaming that he had made a mistake. The symbols had been warnings, not locks. He hadn't found a prison. He had found something waiting to be released. Chapter 13. A Face from the Past. Jonathan stumbled backward, his heart hammering as the creature on the altar fixed its glowing, soulless eyes upon him. His breath caught in his throat as recognition flickered in his mind. It wasn't possible, and yet, the features were unmistakable. The gaunt face, the sunken eyes, the jagged scar along the cheekbone. Jonathan had seen this face before, in a faded photograph, in an old newspaper article, in the journal he had just read. Phileas Graves, the man who had vanished over a century ago, swallowed by the very horror Jonathan had unknowingly disturbed. The chained figure's mouth twisted into something resembling a smile, though it was anything but human. The room around them pulsed, as if reacting to its awakening. The chains, etched with ancient runes, trembled against the weight of its movements. Jonathan's mind reeled. If this was Elias Graves, then had he been here all along? Trapped, bound, transformed? A whisper, soft yet deafening, filled the chamber. "You see me." Jonathan staggered back, his body screaming for him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The statues lining the walls began to shift, their long, clawed fingers stretching toward him. The air crackled with energy, a force older than time itself pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. The whispers had returned, no longer just voices but a cacophony of agonized souls pleading. Elias, or what remained of him, slowly lifted a hand, his elongated fingers trembling, struggling against the restraints. The symbols carved into his flesh glowed with a sickly light, resisting his movements. The door behind Jonathan slammed shut with a force that shook the chamber. "You should not have come," Elias whispered, his voice layered as though spoken by 1,000 mouths at once. "Now, it knows you." Jonathan's mind raced. The door, the symbols, the whispers. It had all been a trap, a carefully woven snare to lure him deeper. He had not stumbled upon a prison. He had walked straight into an offering. The ground beneath him trembled. The statues groaned as if waking from an ancient slumber. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the chamber, reaching for him, twisting around his limbs. The chains binding Elias Graves began to crack. Jonathan turned, his pulse pounding. He had to escape, now. He lunged toward the door, but the moment his fingers brushed the handle, pain exploded through his skull. A scream, his own, someone else's, ripped through the chamber as darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 14. Breaking the Curse. Jonathan stood before the massive stone altar, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The thing in the cellar had been sealed away for a reason, bound by runes that pulsed faintly with a dying light. The creature's glowing eyes burned into his soul as he gripped the ancient dagger he had found in Elias Graves' journal. A choice lay before him: restore the seal or set it free. The voices that had guided him through the darkness now screamed in his ears, urging him to act. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the entity within the altar stirred, sensing its moment of release. Jonathan raised the dagger high, his mind made up. He had come too far to let the darkness win. With a swift motion, he plunged the blade into the center of the altar. A shockwave of energy blasted through the room, the symbols flaring one final time before fading into silence. The creature shrieked as its form was dragged back into the void, its last remnants dissolving into the air. Jonathan fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The whispers had ceased. The house, once alive with unnatural energy, now lay still. It was over. Chapter 15. What Lurks in the Shadows. Jonathan stumbled out of the cellar, his body aching from exhaustion. His breaths came in ragged gasps, the weight of what he had just done pressing heavily upon him. The darkness had receded, its presence diminished, but an eerie silence clung to the house, as if it were holding its breath. He turned to glance back at the entrance to the cellar, half expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes staring back at him. But there was nothing. The room was empty, devoid of movement. Yet, deep down, Jonathan knew better. The thing in the cellar had been sealed, but it had not been destroyed. The old house groaned as a cold draft snaked its way through the corridors, brushing against his skin like ghostly fingers. The whispers were gone, but their absence felt unnatural, like a void left behind. He could still feel unseen eyes watching him, lurking in the shadows beyond the flickering candlelight. He took a step forward, his knees weak. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and old decay. The ancient symbols on the walls, once glowing with the power of the ritual, were now nothing more than faint etchings in the stone. The house had returned to its dormant state, but for how long? Jonathan's fingers tightened around the journal he had recovered. Elias Graves had written extensively about the creature, about its origins, its hunger, and the failed attempts to contain it. He had also written about the ones who had come before him, the ones who had tried to silence the entity, only to become part of the darkness themselves. The more he read, the more he understood. The curse was not something that could be undone. It could only be transferred. A shiver crawled up his spine as realization set in. The whispers, the shifting shadows, the voices that had spoken to him. They had chosen him. By interfering, by breaking the fragile seal, he had become the new guardian of the horror that lurked beneath the house. His mind screamed at him to leave, to flee this wretched place and never look back. But as he reached the front door, he hesitated. If he left, who would ensure that the creature remained contained? Who would stop another wanderer from stumbling upon this house, from making the same mistake he had? Jonathan exhaled sharply. He had no choice. With reluctant steps, he turned back toward the center of the house, back toward the darkness that awaited him. His hands trembled as he placed the journal on the dusty table, its pages whispering secrets long forgotten. Some doors should never be opened, but some must never be left unguarded. As Jonathan stumbled out of the cellar, he cast one last glance behind him. The darkness had receded, but something still lurked in the corners of the house, waiting. The curse had been broken, but not entirely. Some doors should never be opened,